Welcome, everyone, to the Theology and Ethics podcast of the Kirkwood Center. Today, we're going to be talking about some new findings in the area of Darwinian evolution, specifically as it relates to the claims of common descent. To help us on this issue, we've asked a friend of the Kirkwood Center podcast, Dr. Casey Luskin, a senior fellow at Discovery Institute, who tracks these issues very closely, to join us. So, Casey, welcome back. First, how are you doing? And second, what are you doing?
I'm doing well, and at the moment, I'm sitting here enjoying talking to you guys for this podcast. Great to see you both, and great to be back. Been writing a lot lately about the topic of human-chimp genetic similarity. This has come up. Well, I'm sure we'll get into this, but it's come up because of a big paper that was published in Nature last month. So great to be here with you guys.
Okay, and Casey, give us a little bit of your background, just so people know who you are and how you've been so focused on these issues for so long now.
Sure, yeah. So my undergraduate master's is in geology, earth sciences, from the University of California, San Diego, and then I did a PhD in geology from the University of Johannesburg. Also have a law degree from the University of San Diego, and I've been a California licensed attorney. It'll be 20 years this coming November, so hard to believe that. But my day job is I work at Discovery Institute. We're a nonprofit think tank that is sort of the institutional home for intelligent design. And my main role there is I manage our research program. Also do a lot of, helping to advise teachers on how to teach this issue objectively in schools. But primarily I manage research. So we have scientists who are doing research into intelligent design all over the world, making sure that they have the resources that they need to do their research. So it's a lot of fun, but I love to stay on top of the literature. I think my real love, pretty much, I'll give you guys a little window into my world. Every day is like a little marathon to get all of my admin work done, all the management work done, so that I can do some writing, which is what I really love to do.
Yeah.
And so recently I had a trip that took me to the East Coast, Nashville, and Colorado. And I found some time on that trip to actually do some writing, which allowed me to, dig into the topic of human-ape common ancestry, which is a lot of fun. So that's what I do when I get time. Yeah.
Well, obviously, and we had you on. It's been a while now, but we had you on maybe a year and a half ago on the issue of human origins. You had written a paper canvassing like several views. That was sort of in the wake of William Lane Craig's book on the historical Adam. But this is obviously very relevant to that issue that we were talking about a year and a half ago. This new set of papers or research that's come out. So we'll link to the article at Evolution News and Reviews that you wrote on this. But let's go ahead and get into the content of the topics. Maybe before we get to the new data, right, that you're talking about in the article, maybe you can give us a little bit of a historical background on this issue of the quote unquote genetic similarity between chimps and human beings.
Sure. So I'm sure that many of your listeners have heard this claim before, that humans and chimps are only 1% genetically different or 99% genetically the same. We've heard this claim from so many people over the years. And as this issue has come up recently, I kind of dug into my archives and found folks that have made this argument. Bill Nye, the science guy, wrote in his 2014 book, Undeniable, he said, as our understanding of DNA has increased, we've come to understand that we share around 98.8% of our gene sequence with chimpanzees. This is striking evidence for chimps and chumps to have a common ancestor. So there, Bill Nye is using this 99% genetic similarity statistic between humans and chimps to make an affirmative argument for human-chimp common ancestry. Even the Smithsonian Museum of Natural History. I was there a couple years ago. In fact, Tony, you and I were there at the same time. Yeah,
we were
at a conference together. And then my wife was actually in D.C. recently for a friend's graduation from Georgetown, and she went back and checked that the Smithsonian Museum says right there in big letters, in big photograph, you and chimpanzees, 98.8% genetically similar. And it goes below that to use that as sort of an argument for human-chimp common ancestry. And you can give many other examples of folks, authorities who have cited this statistic. So we've all heard this statistic being quoted, but the question is it true? Well, we've actually known for a long time, Anthony and Lenny, that this is not true, that this statistic is wrong. I think that the first draft of the chimpanzee genome was published back in 2005, and a couple years after that, the journal Science actually had an article that came out that was called The Myth of 1%, where they basically said that this 1% genetic difference between human and chimps is a myth, okay? But the problem was that back then, and also even for many years since then, most of the drafts of the chimpanzee genome that we've had used the human genome as a scaffolding when they built those chimp genome drafts. And that meant that the chimp genome looked more human-like than it actually was. And so until now, we have not really had a complete de novo from scratch version of the chimp genome to be able to make a more scientifically accurate comparison between those two genomes.
Okay, so there were these mappings, I guess we call them mappings, that were done 20 years ago, right? In 05, roughly. But they weren't pure like chimp genomes. They were using something like human DNA to recreate the chimp genome, the chimp map.
Yeah, it's something kind of like that. And there have been other versions of the chimp genome that have been done since then also that used the human genome as a guide. Let me kind of explain how you might be able to see this, okay? Let's say that you have those, remember those magnets that you put on your fridge that have different words, and you could arrange the magnets in different orders to make funny sentences, right? Mm-hmm. So let's say that you are trying to move those magnets into the right order so that they spell the right sentence essentially, okay? But you don't know the order that they're supposed to be in. You have these words that you sequenced, but you don't know the right order that they're supposed to go in. That's kind of what it has been like with sequencing the chimp genome. We get these blocks of the chimp genome that we sequenced, but we have to then order them in the right order in order to be able to basically know, the order that they go in the chimp genome. And the way that they have determined the right ordering of those blocks of the chimp genome that they sequenced was by using the human genome as a guide or a scaffolding, okay? So what this did is it made these earlier drafts of the chimp genome look more human-like than they actually were. And this was true for many drafts of the chimp genome. I think there was one draft in 2018 that was supposed to be the first time they actually did a complete, not completed, but a de novo or from scratch version of the chimp genome. But even that version of the chimp genome was not a complete sequence of the chimp genome. So what this new Nature paper has done is it has both provided us with a complete sequence of the chimp genome where they've sequenced the full genome from end to end of each chromosome, and they did it from scratch where they didn't use the human genome as a guide that sort of made these genomes look more human-like than they really were.
So let me give you a picture. I think that'll help our audience a little bit. I like the magnets where each magnet is a separate word, but imagine the words aren't in English. Say the words are in German, but you speak English. So you have no idea what these words are or what they mean. You just know that they're words.
You know they're words.
Well, you may know the translation of each specific word, and you want to write the sentence on the refrigerator for your German foreign exchange student. Will you be home tonight for dinner? And so what you would do is you would look for the German word for will, and then you be right, and you would put those in order and say, here you go, here's the German sentence. Well, anyone who speaks German knows that even though you've used the English as the pattern for that sentence, it's going to be incorrect in German, because in German it would be, will you home for dinner be? They would put the verb in a question at the end of the sentence because that's German grammar. So German grammar varies from English grammar, but all you know is the word and the corresponding definition of what that word is. So what the scientists were doing is they were putting the chimp genome in the order that they saw the human genome placed, just as you would try and translate a sentence from English to German word for word, not realizing that there's a grammar underlying this that breaks
The
the
structure.
structure.
Yeah, the syntax would be different.
Right.
So it's
Great
kind of like
analogy, Lenny.
a biological begging the question, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, possibly, yeah. And to be fair, I think in most cases, the human and the genomes, chimp genomes, they're similar enough that this process worked. But there are times when there are differences, and if you want to be sure that you have a true and accurate draft of the chimp genome, you don't want to be using the human genome as a guide or a scaffolding to get things in the right order, to get the grammar right. Love that analogy, Lenny. I assume you speak German. I don't.
You'll understand it, right? A foreign speaker, if you spoke to somebody who's not, English isn't their first language, you can understand them, but you can immediately tell that it's wrong. So it's not natural.
Okay, so bottom line is compare, and we don't really get motivation doing the best you can in 2025. Now it's 2025. Bottom line is we have a more accurate and precise map of an actual chimp genome, right?
That's
and
right.
Now you can make a more reasonable comparison between chimp and human genome, right?
That's exactly right.
From the one to sort of fill in the gaps on the other.
Yep, you're exactly right. It's much more complete as well, that we can basically have a draft of the chimp genome that we can trust. So finally, we can do a more accurate comparison here. You're exactly right.
Okay, so now, that's good. So you got the more accurate ability to compare the two. Now, what happens when you call the 1% an icon? I think you're maybe referencing, I don't know if Jonathan Wells sort of coined that term of icons of evolution. So that was one of the icons, was the 1% or the 99%, however you want to say it. So where are we at now with this new data and this better comparison with regards to the 1%?
Yeah, exactly, Anthony. So I would say that based upon the data reported in this new Nature paper, that the true degree of genetic difference between humans and chimps is an order of magnitude, at least an order of magnitude greater than that 1% statistic that we were told. It's more like we are 14 to 15% genetically different from chimpanzees. So that's still very similar in many ways, but that's a much, much greater degree of difference than what we've been told in the past. So that old 1% genetic difference icon of evolution, as you said, I think is overturned by this new data.
Now, Casey, in the article, and this may just be a very technical point, but just to clear it up, there are other, are chimps considered part of the ape family? Because there's a couple different kinds of ape members of the ape family or whatever that you mentioned there, with some different numbers. I'm taking it to me that chimps have been considered the closest relative as compared to these other animals.
Yeah, I mean, chimps are certainly apes, and in fact, they are great apes. And in fact, technically speaking, under an evolutionary way of doing classification, humans are also considered to be one of the great apes. Okay, so I think that in normal everyday conversation, and normal people don't consider human beings to be an ape, but certainly chimpanzees are apes. That would also include the great apes. Would also include gorillas, orangutans, and humans, according to the standard evolutionary view. I would not consider human beings to be an ape. I think that's confusing, both on a practical level and also scientifically. I don't think we should be considered an ape, but that's a conversation for another time.
but there were different ranges for each of these different categories of ape as well in the reports. It was chimps, there was gorillas, and other apes on there, and some of those ranges were even larger.
Yes, that's right. So you're exactly right. They sequenced the complete genomes of multiple ape species, not just chimpanzees, but also gorillas, orangutans, and siamangs. And gorillas and orangutans are probably more similar to human than the siamangs are. But the bottom line is that yes, and actually, give me a second here. I can pull up the numbers. The gorilla and orangutans were not nearly as similar to human beings as the chimp. I think the gorillas, it was somewhere between 19 and 29%. Don't quote me exactly on that, but it's somewhere in that range. And for orangutans, it was somewhere around maybe 20% or so difference, genetically speaking, from chimps, from human beings. So yeah, I mean, they are still very different from human beings, but not as different as the chimpanzees are. I'm sorry, but less different than the chimpanzees are. Yeah.
Okay. So the chimpanzees, in that sense, are still the closest, but now the the discrepancy has moved from the so-called 1% to was it 13.3? I think I saw two numbers in there, 13.3% and a 14.9% divergence.
Yeah, so there are different ways of measuring difference between the human genome and the chimp genome. And the first way that they looked at in this paper is what they call the gap divergence, okay? And this is basically the fraction of segments of the chimp genome over the human genome, that when you try to align that segment of one genome with a segment of the other genome, you can't even line them up because they're so different that they just can't even be compared, basically. It's almost like there's a gap when you compare that section of the genome to the other genome. It's almost like it's not there, or it's so different that it can't be aligned, okay?
Okay.
So that is what they call the gap difference. And what they found is that when you average it all out over the whole genome, about 13.3% of the human genome is so different from the chimpanzee genome that it simply can't be aligned with that section, and effectively there's a gap, okay? It's just so different you can't even do a one-to-one nucleotide comparison. Now, there are other large segments of the genome that are similar enough that you can line them up and say, okay, what percentage of the nucleotides are the same? And yeah, the vast majority of the genome can be aligned. And when they do that, they get another type of difference, which they called the single nucleotide variations. And for this, they got a difference of about 1.6%. Basically, 1.6% of human nucleotides in the sections that can be aligned don't match up to nucleotides in the chimp genome. And this is where you got that old 1% statistic, okay? So, but what's interesting is that single nucleotide variation is greater in this new study. It's not 1 or 1.2%, it's 1.6%. And they're finding that an additional 13.3% of the genome is so different, you can't even do a proper alignment to compare the similarity, okay? And so what that means is that you can add those two types of differences together. You can add up the non-alignable sections and with the sections that were alignable and the differences within those sections. So if you add up 13.3% plus 1.6%, you get a total of about 14.9% genetic difference between the human and chimp genomes. Now, what's interesting is they used another analytical tool to compare the human and chimp genomes. It's called a progressive cactus alignment. And this is sort of a computer algorithm that it's very sophisticated, but it compares the two genomes. And that separate method came to a very similar result. And basically it found that the human and chimp genomes, again, are about 15% different. So there's basically two different methods that you can take from the data reported in this paper that are pretty similar results, about a 15% genetic difference between humans and chimps. So when you get different results, different methods giving you a similar result, that kind of gives you confidence that you're onto something right there.
So I'm gonna push back a little bit on this, because I can hear maybe some people in the back of their minds thinking, well, still 85%, that's an amazing amount of similarity, and doesn't that account for something? And how would you answer that? How does this compare? Now we're talking about human chimpanzee, and realize that these kinds of classifications, they're both hominids, right? They're both considered part of the same family in the taxonomy as hominids. But how does this comparison compare to, say, species that are not as physically similar, or as similar in such appearance. I mean, when you look at things like a fruit fly, don't we share at least 60% of the genome with, say, a fruit fly or something like that? So can you, because I can hear people say, well, 85%, doesn't that it still imply that we and apes are just the same?
Commonly descended, yeah.
Yeah, so no, great question you're asking, Lenny. Very, very important. I don't know the exact percent genetic similarity we have to a fruit fly, but I'm sure we do share DNA in common with a fruit fly. The answer to your question, basically 85% similarity. Does that demonstrate that we are evolutionarily related to chimpanzees? And I want to say that what this new data is showing, I have not changed my argument one bit about human-ape common ancestry. And here's why, okay? I've been saying for a long time that whatever the percent genetic similarity between humans and chimps turns out to be, whether it's 99%, other studies had said 96% or 95%, or somebody at one point also suggested 85% or even less than that, okay? Whatever the percent genetic similarity between humans and chimps turns out to be, I've been saying this for a long time, it's not going to tell you anything about whether we share a common ancestor with chimps. And some folks might be a little bit surprised to hear that, but here's why I say that, okay? I've never made an argument saying, oh, we're so genetically different from chimps, therefore common ancestry is refuted. In fact, I've always said that the argument which says that, we're 99% similar to chimps demonstrates common ancestry, I've always said that argument is really logical fallacy. And here's why. Because similar DNA, yes, it can be explained by common ancestry, but it can also be explained by common design, where a designer is building systems based upon a common blueprint. Okay, so the fact that we share DNA in common with a fruit fly, that could very easily represent the fact that there are certain genetic modules that a fruit fly needs to build its body plan that the human being needs to build our body plan, carrying oxygen through the blood, or, building neurons, or, building, ribosomes. You're going to need some DNA that's going to be in common between a human being and even something that's different as a fruit fly, because we have certain biochemical and genetic features in common. Okay.
Yeah.
And when you then look at an ape, it's going to be even more similar, because we are based upon the mammalian body plan. We are based upon a primate body plan. And so the fact that we share similarities could easily represent common design as much as common ascent. And designers will regularly reuse parts that work in different designs. I mean, this is nothing new. If you're an engineer or designer, people will reuse wheels on both cars and airplanes, or you'll reuse keyboards on both cell phones and tablets, or computer programmers. I've done a lot of programming. You guys probably done some as well. What does the programmer always do when they write a new program? Here's what I always do. The first thing I do when I write a new computer program is I hit Control-C, Control-V, okay? I copy a previous program that I'd written that does something similar to the new program I want to write, so I can basically borrow the code that works, okay? And programmers do this all the time. They borrow or steal code from other sources. I mean, that's why Stack Exchange exists, is so you can get answers to your coding questions and borrow code from other people, okay? So this is a normal design practice to reuse functional parts that work in different designs. So the fact that we share 85% DNA, genetically speaking, with our with chimpanzees could be the result of common design just as much as it could reflect common descent. I don't see this as a deciding factor one way or the other.
And some of it is limited by the very chemistry in our universe. For example, we are carbon based in our life forms, because carbon has unique properties. That molecule has unique properties that allows things like motion. So if your muscles are going to work, if you're going to move something biologically, you need a sugar. You need a glucose in order to use ATP in order to express that, in order to make the cells move. And silicone-based stuff just won't do. Any other, carbon is just functional. So oxygen needs to be existing for life to exist, because oxygen and carbon work together with the sugar molecule to make muscles move. And it doesn't matter if you're talking about, what you're talking about within the cell. All cells work in that way, because that's how carbon works. You have to use these kinds of things in order for them to function. No one has built a better mousetrap, or just because all builders, use a toilet doesn't mean that one builder is a subsidiary of another, right? They could. It's just like, this is the thing that works, so this is how we have to use it.
And Lenny, the reasons for those similarities, you may make some great points there. I would even argue that the reasons for the similarities between organisms goes even deeper. My wife is a pescatarian, but I tease her sometimes saying, well, if we're not supposed to eat animals, then why did God make them taste so good? But why do animals taste so good? It's because they have protein, okay? And protein is something that our bodies need. We eat the protein and we can immediately digest and break down the amino acids in, and also plants also have protein, right? It's not just animals. So, but all the foods we eat have nutrients we need, proteins, amino acids, nucleotides, other nutrients that we need. And the reason that they have those nutrients that we need is because they are also built upon a common blueprint. They're using the same kinds of biomolecules that we are. They're using amino acids. They're using nucleotides, et cetera, et cetera. And that means that it allows them to be nutritious for us. So part of the food web that we see in this world is designed so that when organisms eat other organisms, they're getting the nutrients they need. But in order for it to be that way, they've got to have all kinds of biochemical similarities. Carbon and oxygen is just the beginning. They've got to also use things like amino acids, nucleotides, so that they can use the chemicals that they're digesting from the food, the organisms that they're eating, and have them be able to, be used by the predator organism so that they can use that to live. And so I think that there's a lot of reasons, just ecologically speaking, why you want to have very deep biochemical similarities between organisms.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I mean, and I'm thinking too, I think you'd be right. You could make some theological speculation about why God would design his creatures similarly in a sort of relational sense. So, we can relate to creatures that are in some way similar to us. That, when you look at a chimp, does have behavior like us, does look like us to some degree. And that can maybe, there's something that emerges there that is of theological and significance, right? That we're not utterly distinct from the other kinds of creatures that God has made, or the intelligent designer has made. Yeah,
absolutely, Anthony. I mean, when your dog breaks its leg, you know what to do. You need to help set that leg because it has a body plan very similar to yours. We are able to care for our animals in the way that, that as a Christian, that's actually biblical command to care for animals that are in your life. And so we're able to do that because we know something about how their bodies work. And that's because God, I do believe that God is the designer. That's a theological claim, not coming from intelligent design. But, I believe in a theological sense that allows us to know how to care for our animals. So,
yes.
We can get theological with that. I agree with that. Yeah. It
gives us empirical evidence of the value of other creatures, right? That have been made. So let me ask this question then. From within a non-design, materialistic, full-blown sort of Darwinian evolutionary theory, from within that framework that would exclude design, within that framework, what is this new data? What's the significance of the new data for the theory itself?
Yeah, how's it being received on the other end of the spectrum?
Well, I mean, first of all, it just came out, so I think that we're going to have to wait a long time to see where the chips fall and how people react to this. My suspicion is that folks who have been using that 99% genetic similarity, 1% difference statistic as an argument for human chip common ancestry, they're not going to like this because rhetorically speaking, and both factually and rhetorically, this refutes their argument, their use of that icon of evolution to argue for human chimp common ancestry and human evolution. So some folks are not going to like that. We are beginning to see some pushback from some folks. In fact, one example is somebody who I think Anthony, Joshua Swamidass, who commented on this paper on X with his Twitter account. Joshua Swamidass, of course, is a computational biologist at Washington University of St. Louis. he's a Christian, he's a believer, and he's also a very strong public proponent of human-ape common ancestry. And so, and I think he would agree with that he very much endorses and promotes that view. So one of the ways that he responded to this on X is he said, well, a lot of those gap divergence differences, the sequences that just don't line up, he said they represent, quote, trivial cut and paste repetitions. So basically you've got this repetitive DNA in the human genome, and it looks like you just copied some extra repeats. And so when he calls it trivial, what he's alluding to is the idea that this is just junk DNA, okay? These are just random differences that accumulated between the human and chimp genomes. They don't mean anything. And so he would emphasize, the single nucleotide variations, that 1.6%, and that's important. I'm sure there's a lot of important information carried in those differences. But what he's basically saying is that a lot of these gap differences, we can kind of just dismiss them or ignore them because they're not meaningful. They represent, quote unquote, trivial genetic information, which essentially is junk DNA. And there is a very good response to that argument. And I actually blogged about this on Evolution News. Before I even knew that Joshua Swamidass had made this argument, I had already written this blog, that there was another paper that came out also very recently in the journal Nucleic Acids Research. And it was authored by some of the same authors who worked on the original Nature paper sequencing these new complete ape genomes. And what they talked about in this Nucleic Acids Research paper is the nature of a lot of the different DNA that's different between humans and chimps, according to this new study. And what they said is, yes, a lot of that DNA is repetitive. But then what they said is that does not mean that it is therefore junk. In fact, they said that a lot of the repetitive DNA differences between humans and chimps is something called non-B DNA. And non-B DNA is a kind of DNA that can take on structural roles, okay? It can form certain shapes within the genome. And those shapes can be very important for genomic function. And it has to do with exactly what Joshua Swamidass is dismissing, the number of copies of repeats of this repetitive DNA that you get in the DNA. And in fact, the paper says that this non-B repetitive DNA is, quote, important regulators of cellular processes and, quote, has unequivocal importance for genome function. And they go through a whole list of various functions that this repetitive DNA can take. So basically what this Nucleic Acids Research paper is saying is that the very repetitive DNA that was discovered to be different between humans and chimps can be highly functional. And we should not be dismissing it as just trivial DNA that is junk. And so that's a very important point we have to make as we talk about this.
This is really interesting when we start looking at biology more largely and all of the work that's going on, because Casey, as you know, we talked about last year, the Nobel Prize that came out for the micro ribosomes, right? The mRNA that was working as an inhibitor to gene expression. And one of the functions that it would do is it would shut off making copies of certain genes. And if you remove that, then it would make too many copies. And what's interesting here is what we're seeing is there's a specific difference now in human and ape, whereas this secondary control seems to be purposely not being expressed or being expressed later, or however you want to look at it, in order for different functions to appear in the larger organism. So it's just as much and I'm fascinating to see where down the road if these two findings converge someplace, because it's not simply the DNA. See, there's a fallacy that seems to be going on undergirding all of this, is to assume that DNA is the primary understanding of who we are. And I think that's a big leap in and of itself. I was talking with Frank Beckwith, and one of the things that he said is, the thing that everybody assumes is that chemistry is the stopping point. Why are you using chemistry? Why are you using DNA as the basis of comparison? Why aren't you using, say, physics? Because if you use physics, if you use molecular bonds, we're 100% the same as a chimp. But then again, we're 100% the same as a table. So similarity as such doesn't tell us much unless you're assuming certain things that come underneath it, like DNA is the answer to what makes us us. There's no talk of the soul. There's no talk of ideas that are disparate between the two. But there's only talk about this just chemical matching. And I'm just curious to see how this all plays out down the road.
No, you raised some great points, Lenny. And Frank Beckwith is somebody I've known for a long time, very good philosopher, done a lot of great work. And yeah, absolutely. Like, what are the nature of the differences that we're talking about? There is certainly information in biology, in the human body, in our cells, that is outside of the DNA. We now know that there's a lot of information carried on the surfaces of cell membranes of cells in the form of carbohydrates and sugars that are expressed on the surfaces of those cells. And that information, by and large, is inherited from the mother. When you receive the egg from your mother and the cell membrane from your mother's egg, that imports information that your whole body then copies as you grow and develop as an embryo into a human being. Same is true for other forms of information in the human body. There's information that exists outside of the DNA, epigenetic information. So that's absolutely true. The DNA information is not the whole story here, and we need to remember that. But there's also something called the proteome. Okay, the proteome are the proteins that are the set of the proteins that are expressed by the genome. So, of course, ultimately the proteome does derive from the genome, but I'm going to make these numbers up right now, but a 15% difference in the genome could potentially lead to I don't even know, like 30% difference in the proteome, because the way that proteins are processed and the way proteins are expressed in cells is not just dependent upon the genome information. It's dependent upon a whole host of genetic information that exists in the cells and post-transcriptional processing that goes on through a lot of different RNAs, very complex things like alternative splicing and RNA editing and many other processes that determine the sequences of proteins that are not simply, just one-to-one derived from the DNA. So I hope that someday we can look at a comparison of the human and chimp proteome, and I suspect we'll see a difference that's much greater there.
Yeah, it's very much like, again, like writing computer code. Your operating system makes a huge difference, right? So if you're writing in Visual Basic, apostrophe is going to mean something different than if you're writing in PHP or if you're writing in C#, or, it's the same symbol, but it does different things based on the OS, based on the language of the engine that's expressing it.
Yeah, exactly. You could, back in the day when we thought that the human and chimp genome were only different by about 4%. I'm gonna have to change this slide in all my talks now, okay? But I had a slide in my talks that used the famous speech that Darth Vader gives to Luke in Empire Strikes Back when he confesses to Luke that he's his father. And instead of saying, Luke, I am your father, of course, that's a Mandela effect quote. He doesn't actually say that. It's something a little bit different. But instead of saying, Luke, I am your father, let's just change 4% of the words in that little speech that Vader gives, where he says, Luke, I'm not your father. You cannot join me. We will not rule the galaxy as father and son. You cannot destroy the emperor, or I have not foreseen it. Change just a few percent of the words in that little speech, and you get a totally different meaning. So a small percent genetic difference could potentially lead to a much bigger, as we say, phenotypic difference when the genome is being expressed in the organism that it produces. And that's a big point we've got to keep in mind as well.
Yeah. So a micro change can lead to a very big macro change.
Very true.
Right. Okay. All right. So within that framework, so the common descent advocate is going to be looking to try and maybe say that these gaps are not important. Okay. Or they're insignificant in some way. But it seems to be that the case is either way, this is a big difference from what had been reported for a very long time.
That is the big story here.
This is not, it just no longer is the icon of 1% or 99 point whatever percent. So, and I know you don't want to speculate, we don't want to speculate too much on this, but in the article, you do raise the question of like a lot of the data seem to have been buried in the back of the article. And of course, it does seem like some of this has been known, but maybe underreported, if not suppressed, underreported. I mean, I don't know. Again, maybe you don't want to speculate too much on the sociological aspect of this, but if you have any thoughts on that, go ahead and why don't you share them with us right now?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's something worth talking about because, look, this finding, Anthony, as you correctly say, has profound implications, not just for science, but for questions about human exceptionalism, for philosophical questions.
It's got symbolic value, right? Like when you mentioned the Smithsonian earlier, when you go in there and you see this, and of course you're there, they got the statues and the images as well, right? It has this impact on the psyche, right? It has, it's certainly leading to a philosophical or theological, in a philosophical and theological direction, right?
These statistics have been heavily marketed because people believe that they have implications that people will take from them, whether they state them explicitly or not. They've really been promoted, as you just said, absolutely. And look, they do have implications for philosophical questions about human exceptionalism, maybe even theological questions, certainly scientific questions. And that aside, it's just been talked about a lot. The percentage similarity has been talked about in all the journals by Nature, by Science. If you go down the list, everybody's talked about that 98, 99% similarity statistic. So what was weird was that when Nature published this paper, and also an explainer article in Nature that's supposed to kind of boil things down and make it easier for the non-technical expert to understand what's going on, neither the technical paper nor the explainer article in Nature ever said clearly and plainly, these data show approximately, 13.3 to 15% genetic difference between humans and chimps. They never said it in a clear sentence that was like just right there, putting it out for you. Instead, they actually really buried these numbers in the supplementary data in this really obscure technical jargon that was very difficult to find and interpret. I had to do my own calculations and check with other biologists to make sure that I was doing it right, just to come up with that number, and it never was it stated clearly or plainly. I don't know if that was deliberate and they wanted to sort of like not state this clearly. You don't have to get into all the implications, but just state the data point clearly,
Right.
14.9% genetic difference is what this shows between humans and chimps. Let everybody else talk about the implications. I'm fine with that. But why couldn't they state that clearly?
Yeah,
I don't know.
It was the point of the paper too, right? The point of the paper was to find what the actual numbers were.
Well, they said that you were going to be able to do better genome comparisons, but then they didn't actually clearly state the result of that comparison. It was weird. So it seems like maybe for people who really touted that 1% statistic, that were only 1% different from chimps, that these conversations were not entirely welcome to them. I mean, that's the sense you get. I don't know for sure what was going on in their heads. And I know that every scientific paper, publishing papers, is kind of like sausage making. You have many authors on a paper like this. You might have different views and different approaches. And then, of course, you have the reviewers. They have their say in what the paper says, and the journal has its say. So, it's a big sausage making exercise. So I can't speak for any one person in particular, but all I know is that something went wrong here in the fact that they could not clearly state these findings for the public to see. And for non-technical experts shouldn't have to dig. I should not be the one breaking the story. Okay. Nature should have broken the story. I'm not a genome scientist. I shouldn't have had to dig through this paper to figure out what it said. It should have been stated clearly for me. So why didn't they do that? It just raises an interesting question.
I mean, okay. Yeah, that's good. I mean, like I said, we don't want to be, it raises the question though. I mean, it raises the question and, of what worldview lenses are at play and how that might be shading the way the paper is then presented or released to the public. Okay. So Casey, I don't know, do you want any speculations about what might come next? I mean, are there further sort of mappings or comparisons that we might expect to happen in lieu of this, or other findings that we would think might come of it? What's your, any predictions for the future?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's going to be more scientists doing follow-up studies, looking at these complete ape genomes and trying to do, what we're talking about right now, doing a precise comparison and publishing that, because these are papers that are just waiting to get published. Me talking about it is not going to satisfy, the scientific journals. There's going to be some scientists out there, I hope and assume, that are going to want to do an actual study that publishes the exact percent genetic difference and similarity that they get, from these new genomes, and does it in a clear way that is stating it, for people to actually talk about. I hope that's done. And when it is done, I look forward. Whatever the answer is, I'm open to it. I'm pretty sure that, the calculations we did based upon this Nature paper were right. Like I said, we consulted with multiple biologists to make sure we were getting it right. And I feel pretty confident in this, but whatever the number is in the end, I mean, I'll accept it, and I'm not really, I don't really think it's going to have major direct, hard and fast implications for human ape common ancestry, whatever that number is. I think that there's other ways that you can challenge human ape common ancestry, but I don't think that the percent genetic similarity one way or the other is just telling us much about that.
Do you think, I mean, as we continue down the road, and of course, we are learning more and more about gene expression, as we talked about, the idea that all of this so-called junk DNA actually isn't junk DNA. It's actually crucial in order for proteins and to be expressed properly. I would imagine, my gut is that as we learn more about that process, we will find even greater and greater differences, because these are the areas that people actually aren't looking at or are dismissing as something, non-coding. So therefore it's somehow not relevant. So I would imagine that as we find out more about how the total process works, how the expression works, that we're going to see greater differences, not fewer.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's safe to say that the more we study genomics and molecular biology, the more complicated it gets, okay? And so I think there's no question that as that complication goes deeper, you're going to find deeper and deeper differences at different levels. I don't know exactly what they're going to be, but I will certainly predict we're going to find more differences as time goes on. And I think as time goes on, we're going to find that more and more folks are, I mean, this has already been happening, but this idea that these differences just represent junk DNA, I hope and suspect that objection is not going to carry much water.
Yeah. And then the percentage, regardless, I mean, minimally you'd say it can't be trotted out as an argument against human exceptionalism, right? Even if you would say the percentage can't be used maybe in an argument for uniqueness, it also can't be trotted out and said, oh, look, this percentage means or translates into, common descent, or, in some way is antagonistic towards the idea that human beings are clearly distinct and different, qualitatively different from chimps.
Yeah, well, whatever the percent difference is, at the end of the day, it's humans that write scientific papers about apes, not the other way around. So clearly there are some important differences going on here that are very meaningful. I think that human exceptionalism, you have to really close your eyes to reality to deny that.
Yeah.
But yeah, as far as the strict question of common ancestry goes, I just don't think that it's going to tell us that much. Yeah.
Right. Okay. All right. Well, it's interesting stuff. Casey, it's definitely good to have you back on to talk about these things. And, maybe as things progress, we'll have to have you back on. We'll keep track of the articles that you put out there on news and evolution news and reviews. So I want to thank everybody for listening to this episode of the podcast. If you've enjoyed it, please hit the subscribe and the like buttons below. And we look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Theology and Ethics podcast of the Kirkwood Center. Please take a moment to leave a review on your podcast app of choice. If this episode made you think of someone you know, please share it with them. If you want to get in touch with the Kirkwood Center, you can call or text us at 909-493-7799 or send us an email at contact@kirkwoodcenter.org. You can also visit our website at kirkwoodcenter.org. If you want to join the theology and ethics conversation and see more content, you can find the Kirkwood Center on Facebook, Instagram, X, and YouTube and Substack. Until next week, my name is Anthony Costello. Thank you for listening to the Kirkwood Center podcast, and we look forward to hearing from you. Until then, God bless.